Join Dr. Coffee Brown to discuss what's new in health and medicine. Dr. Brown and his guests explore the latest research and technology in health and medicine and help us understand how it affects our lives. Then they provide takeaways and steps we can take to improve our own health in the future. We're glad you're here to take part in the conversation. In this episode, Dr. Coffee Brown's guest is Dr. Joe Alcock MD, who is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center. Dr. Alcock is a leader in the emerging field of evolutionary medicine. His current research uses evolutionary principles to understand cooperation and conflict in the human gut microbiome related to acute and chronic diseases. Thanks for joining us today, and now back to our host, Dr. Coffee Brown.
Joe, it's great to finally get a chance to visit with you again. I know you went through a lot of schedule juggling and some troubleshooting today to join us. Thank you for your patience and thank you for the effort. What's going on with you lately?
Yeah, thanks, Coffee, for inviting me to chat with you today. We are emerging from this crazy pandemic. I think things are getting back to normal, or at least more normal at work in emergency medicine. I will be working a shift later on today that, we're not dealing with tons of people coming in with COVID anymore. So we'll just, chalk that one up as a major plus. But lots of other things are going on. I'm busy still writing papers and doing some research, both with evolutionary medicine and on the topic of a microbiome, which I understand we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, on that point, I want to point out that Dr. Alcock has a ridiculous resume of expertise, including wilderness medicine, sepsis, and he's very, very cutting edge in the study of sepsis. He's an emergency medicine physician, so you tend to think that you're looking at more acute things, but Joe studies pretty in-depth research. He does a lot of wet lab work. And our topic today is microbiomes. But you've climbed Mount Everest, you've studied sepsis in the third world, you've written, and of course you've been blogging on evolutionary medicine for a long time. That was your degree before medicine. So I'm kind of teeing up that I hope we'll get more than one conversation with you. But today,
sure,
it's all about
Everest. Everest is still on my list. I gotta say.
Okay. I thought you had already done Everest,
Yep.
But you've been climbing in Nepal, though, right?
Been in Cotopaxi and on the flanks of Mont Blanc. So
didn't mean to exaggerate. Well, but now your CV looks downright humble.
Everest, yeah.
Well, that just makes your CV look humble now.
Right.
So what the heck are microbiomes, and why would our listeners care about them?
Well, I've always been interested in things that are a little bit under the surface. So, Coffee, you and I have talked a lot in previous podcasts that we've done about evolution and about how evolutionary biology guides a lot of medicine. And the same is true for microbiomes. When I went to medical school, that word I don't think was mentioned during my 4 years at UCLA in med school. I don't think it was mentioned during my residency here at the University of New Mexico. But it turns out that these microbiomes, these communities of microbes, these microorganisms that live in us and on us, are super important for our health and our well-being. And that's something we've just kind of learned about recently. So I can go more into that. But one thing I'll say, Coffee, is that when you're looking at me through the screen right now, you might think that I am a mammal or that I'm a human man.
I don't want to accuse you of being a mammal, but yes, I did think that.
We might think that I'm a mammal, but it turns out that I'm at least as microbial as I am mammal. So there are approximately 30 trillion plus or minus cells that are mammal in me, and there are 30 trillion plus or minus microbes in me. That number is up for debate, but it's about the same. I think most people agree that it's about the same. Some people think that we're actually outnumbered by the number of microbes. So I'm a composite. I'm a hybrid. I'm a chimera. I am both microbe and mammal.
And that's actually not as radical a new idea as it might sound to some of our listeners, because what about mitochondria?
That's a great point. So when this idea that we have these cooperative arrangements with microorganisms in our bodies, that does certainly was predated by our understanding of mitochondria. Each one of our cells, our eukaryotic cells, contains this little energy-producing organelle called a mitochondrion, and it's thought that the whole eukaryotic lineage, of which we and all other animals are a part of, that was the consequence of two tiny single-celled organisms, one engulfing the other, and then having the other live inside of it. So that's where we think mitochondria came from.
Yeah.
Which
And
is really neat.
to this day, these little cells within our cells have their own DNA and reproduce semi-autonomously inside of our cells. So we've always had a symbiote living with us. And this goes back into, I believe, every eukaryotic cell we know of has mitochondria, right? I'm not aware of any that don't.
As far as I know, and of course, plants have their own version, which is a chloroplast, which has some similarities. And even some protozoa have a similar arrangement, like malaria, for instance.
And I should clarify, when we say eukaryotic, we mean a cell that has a nucleus inside of its own envelope. The slightly more primitive version of cells doesn't have the DNA material inside of its own envelope. That makes a difference in some contexts, but probably not something we need to go into here. But we do want to be careful, Joe, about jargon, because this is for the educated non-medical person.
Absolutely.
So, a lot of us, when we think about microbiome, those of us who have gotten used to the phrase at all, my first thought is usually critters that live in our colon, but they live in many other places in our body and on our body as well. So when you think microbiome, what are you visualizing?
So you're right. And this has been this major breakthrough in our understanding of kind of the nature of our own human biology and how we get along on this planet, that there are all these communities of microbiomes in different places on our bodies. And you're right, the majority are in our guts. But there's a microbiome on your skin, there's a microbiome in your nose, in your eye, in reproductive organs, and in a variety of places. But essentially, I'll summarize that by saying that they're in us and on us. And when I say in us, mostly in our guts.
Yeah, we learn about germs, which are a catch-all term for microscopic creatures. And we learn about them in the context of pathology, things that can harm us, like COVID, or usually when we think germs, we're thinking bacteria, so more like a pneumonia. But in fact, more of them help us than harm us, or at least probably around as many, wouldn't you think?
Right. And I think you and I in the past, we've talked about this thing called the hygiene hypothesis. And that's this idea that in our modern life, we are oftentimes born in hospitals, in a sterile environment. We are treated with antibiotics. We live in places where we're not exposed to microbes in dirt or in the environment. And that has a radical effect on our bodies. And some people think that that lack of exposure to germs or microbes in some ways is what's responsible for diseases that cause a lot of human suffering, like, for instance, autoimmune diseases. So that's true. So yeah, this idea that microbes can be helpful or useful to us is a very is a good one, and I think it's a good starting place for understanding the microbiome. That not all germs are bad. Some of them are neutral, and many of them, in fact, are helpful.
We often take antibiotics pretty readily nowadays. I've been on them 2 or 3 times probably in my life so far. They change our microbiome, sometimes for the worse. How does that work?
There are researchers who believe that multiple doses of antibiotics can cause local extinction events. So microbes that are then just gone from inside of you. And of course, that's sort of the aim of antibiotics, right? Is to kill germs and kill bugs. And in some cases, it does radically change the microbe community in your guts. That's one reason why we should avoid trying to, we should avoid as doctors treating or over-treating with antibiotics. We should use them only when they're necessary. So that's one lesson. Of course, there are other reasons to not overuse antibiotics, like antibiotic resistance. But that's another issue that also involves the microbiome. So if, for instance, you go in with, I don't know, a cold. So let's imagine you don't have COVID, you just have a regular old cold. You go to the doctor prescribes you an antibiotic like penicillin, and you take that course of penicillin. You might change your microbiota by getting rid of some microbes, but you might also then have resistant microbes that live in your microbiota, and those can come back to haunt you if they make you sick later on, because the second time you come in and you have a bacterial infection that we try to treat with antibiotics, those antibiotics might not work. So this is something that I try to explain to my patients when we have these kinds of conversations. The bottom line is that I think the microbiome is a double-edged sword. It can both hurt you and help you. And the same is true for medical interventions like antibiotics. When they're useful, they're really useful. But sometimes they can also cause some harms.
Because we co-evolved, and almost by definition, when we're normally healthy, our microbiome is neutral or helpful to us. But when we kill off a bunch of our microbiome, as our gut recolonizes, often the wrong sort move into the neighborhood, right? So I think to understand how that can work, maybe you might tell us a little bit about coevolution, especially as it applies to microbiomes. What is coevolution? What does that mean?
All right, so coevolution is just a word that acknowledges that we have evolved alongside other organisms and other organisms that are important for health. We've co-evolved with pathogens too, but in this case, we've co-evolved with certain very useful and beneficial microbes. The best example of this is probably the microbes in the guts of breastfed infants. So babies that receive breast milk for nutrition, those grow a specific strain of bifidobacteria that protect babies from infection and keep them healthy. And can have lifelong effects. So many of the benefits that we think of that come from breastfeeding come in part or sometimes in whole from these interactions with growing a healthy microbiome. And this is called Bifidobacterium infantis.
So I actually want my baby to have bacteria?
You want your baby to have good bacteria. There are a variety of bad ones, and we doctors, we screen for those at birth that we want to avoid.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about how our microbiome can help us. I think how they can harm us is pretty obvious. You know, we get a upset stomach or diarrhea or much, much sicker than that. But what are some ways in which it can help us?
Well, one, we talked about how the microbes exist in large part in your colon, and they're not just sitting there hanging out. They are responsible for the fermentation of dietary fiber. So when it comes to things that you can do to make your life and your body healthier, one thing which is very important is to increase the amount of dietary fiber in your diet by eating fruits and vegetables. In large part, that's the main source of dietary fiber. That we call it fiber because we think of it as being indigestible, which means that we can't absorb the energy from that fiber in our small intestine, but it gets delivered to our large intestine, and that's where the microbes go to work. And we have a variety of fermenters there that change that dietary fiber into things called short chain fatty acids. You don't need to remember that word, but that's just a source of energy that your body can use. So those fermentation byproducts, they're good for you. Having a microbe or microbiome that is has a lot of these fermenters that are able to take care of dietary fiber, that's also good for you. And the opposite, if you look at a bad diet, a junk food diet, a diet that is very high in refined sugars, that tends to be unhealthy for you, in part because you haven't cultivated this group of beneficial microbes in your guts.
Now, on your podcast, your very excellent podcast, Evolutionary Medicine, by the way, it's it's denser than this is intended to be, designed to be. So people who are sort of more hardcore sciencey may want to follow up on some of this on your podcast site. The reason I bring it up now is we've talked about the impact of the microbiome on things like immune function and even mood, psychology, endocrine effects. And I think that those are things that likely are not making it into the lay press yet and might be worth talking about.
Oh, sure. So you're right. The two areas that I think people tend to rightly pay a lot of attention to are the effects of the microbiome on your immune system. So we already talked about autoimmune diseases. And some people with autoimmune diseases have found that those symptoms can sometimes be managed in part by probiotics or dietary interventions that have an effect that works on your body through the microbiome. I don't want to give too much credit to this idea. It's not like your microbiome does everything or can solve or cure all diseases. That is not the case. But there are measurable effects on your body with regard to your immune system. And we can get back to that. I think even more exciting is the idea that microbes can affect your brain and your behavior, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy, right? So early on when I said, hey, when you look at me, I'm as much microbe as man, that's true of the cells in my body. The idea that microbes could be in charge in part for the activity of our brain and our behavior is one which is just mind-blowing, right? It just really seems way out there and somewhat crazy. But this is something that we've explored on my blog, and thanks for mentioning that. That's evolutionmedicine.com. But also, I have another podcast that we'll get to at the end of this called Zombified, and we'll talk more about that. We've really explored these ideas that our brains can be hijacked by microbes and sometimes viruses too, in ways that may not be in our own best interest. Should I talk more about that?
Yes, I'm going to give a short example though first.
Okay,
Right now, the
do.
17-year cicada swarm is happening.
Yeah.
A particular fungus is attacking these guys, and it destroys them from what would amount to the waist down, meaning they cannot reproduce, they have no genitalia anymore, but they copulate like crazy. Now, this is an example of a non-intelligent, I was going to say non-sentient microbe hijacking the nervous system of a more advanced organism in order to make it do its bidding, which is to go out and infect other bugs by trying to mate with them. We see this with toxoplasmosis, making mice brave around cats. So the cat eats the infected mouse, gets the toxoplasmosis, poops it out, and spreads it around that way. We also see it with rabies, which kills its host, which is normally a bad idea for a virus, but it makes its host often, not always, aggressive first to spread the rabies around. So the notion that microbes can affect the behavioral aspects of higher organisms is spooky and really not that outre. It's kind of a known thing. And it turns out the microbiome does a fair amount of that, and Joe knows a ton about it. So that's kind of a tee up, I hope, for you.
Yeah, thanks, Coffee, for bringing up those super good examples. The cicadas, that's a real thing. And that is a parasite that is responsible for that complete hijacking. There's an ant that also is parasitized by a fungus, and that when the ant is infected by the fungus, it completely changes its behavior. Instead of going back to the colony, it climbs up a blade of grass or a tall bit of vegetation. A fruiting body emerges from its head and spreads spores everywhere. And sometimes a grazer or the next animal in the life cycle will encounter those spores in that way. It completely hijacks the nervous system of the ant. And really, in the animal kingdom, these entomological or insect examples are the best examples of how parasites can completely take over the brains of another organism. But you also mentioned toxoplasmosis, which is a parasite very common in cats and in mice. And the mouse that's infected by this parasite radically changes its behavior. Instead of being afraid of the urine smell of its, let's say cat pee, which most mice and other rodents are typically afraid of, the smell of the urine of their predator, these mice are actually attracted to it. And so they hang out in places where they're more likely to get eaten by cats. That's very good for the cat, and good for the parasite, but not so good for the mouse in that example. And so the question is, does that sort of thing happen in people? You mentioned rabies, and rabies is a good example of a virus that completely overwhelms our brains and spinal cords and nervous systems in ways that help, we think, spread that particular terrible virus. But this is a story about microbiomes. So the question is, does that happen? What do microbiomes have to do with this story of brain hijacking? And again, we can point to examples in mice. There have been experiments where it turns out that the mood or the anxiety level of a mouse is determined by the contents of their guts. And we know this because there were two different kinds of mice that came from two different suppliers. One was very brave and would go out and explore its environment, and one was very timid and would tend to stay in little shelters and was very hard to get it to go explore. What these experimenters did was they took the microbiomes from each microbe and they swapped them. They gave them to the other kind of mouse, and they changed their behavior. The brave mice became timid, and the timid mice became more brave. And that was, we think, caused by the bacterial content or the microbes that were in the guts of these things. And these are similar bacteria that we encounter in our own microbiomes. And some people have followed up on this, and there is we'll say a signal in experiments that have been done in people that we can see some similar kinds of things, that anxiety behaviors can be influenced by microbiomes in our own guts, and that we actually might be able to modify things like anxiety and depression using these specialized microbes. And that's a whole, there are academic careers going on right now where we're investigating these things, which is super neat.
Yeah, and you might say a word or two about the obese versus normal weight mice.
So in addition, or maybe along with these changes in anxiety behaviors, and most of these studies have been done in mice, and we can't really ask the mice if they're anxious or depressed, but they sometimes will act anxious and depressed, as I mentioned, and that seems to be influenced by microbes. But yeah, obesity goes along with this. It turns out that many of these behaviors where microbes seem to be causing anxiety behaviors are the same microbes that also cause obesity, which again, when I learned about this, it was like mind-blowing, totally crazy. What do you mean microbes cause or can influence your body weight and your metabolism? But ever since a land-breaking study by Frederick Backhead and colleagues, I believe at University or WashU, where they studied mice. And again, that study was they had mice that were genetically predisposed to become very obese. But in this study, they raised them germ-free. They raised them by a little experimental C-section, and they kept them in a germ-free container. And mice that were raised that way stayed very lean, and they weren't fat like their litter mates that were living an ordinary life. As soon as those microbes were exposed to the poop of their litter mates, they rapidly became obese. So again, mind-blowing result, crazy. It led to a lot of excitement, including myself, that maybe we could medically treat things like obesity with microbes. And there are some studies that are hinting that we can have some effects in people that are beneficial and treat things like diabetes and metabolic syndrome in people using microbes. But the results and the effects are nowhere near as dramatic as what we saw in mice. Mice are not men or women. And so these experiments, unfortunately, they've not translated to microbes, as an effective treatment for obesity.
We have more control over our own access to different foods. We have more addictive foods that are made available to us, and our behaviors are in general affected by more parameters than those of the rodents. This kind of tees up, I'm really interested in your take on this, Joe. On the one hand, I suspect that this is going to become at least a subspecialty and eventually maybe even a specialty within medicine. At the same time, I'm a little bit worried that people are already hanging out a shingle going, in microbiome therapy here. Every time something new comes up in medicine, somebody who's read 2 or 3 articles in Scientific American declares themselves an expert and starts a clinic. And that's a very consistent pattern. And of course, we're seeing it with microbiomes too. What are your thoughts about that? Is this going to become a clinical specialty, and how do we know who knows what they're doing?
Right. It at the closest I think it's come to being a clinical specialty is in the field of gastroenterology. Gastroenterologists or GI doctors are very interested in gut diseases, and it turns out microbiomes are really plugged into whether you have inflammatory bowel disease, for instance. So they at least in my own hospital at UNM, the people that seem to be most receptive to these ideas tend to be gastroenterologists. There are some psychiatrists who are very interested in the brain part of this story. But you're right. Anything that's not quite mainstream oftentimes gets picked up by maybe alternative providers, and maybe some people that have less of an interest in the science and more of an interest in making money selling supplements or that sort of thing. So you have to be wary of that. It's my hope that this will become a very well accepted area in medicine. And it's also my hope that some of these evolutionary ideas, the idea that we've co-evolved with these microbes, it has some real importance when it comes to the microbiome. And as we've discussed, impacts things that are really important for human health, like autoimmune diseases, like obesity, like prediabetes or metabolic syndrome, like anxiety and depression. The idea there is this whole domain of physiology that we've been ignoring in medical school. It opens opportunities, and it's one that I think that we should seize in medical school and in university hospitals and in academic medicine, which is what I do.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've been right out at the front of all this right along. As usual, there are two errors that we can make. One, which I was guilty of, is underestimating the importance of a new field of medicine. I think mRNA is going to be huge. Genetic engineering is going to be huge,
Right.
both for good and ill. Microbiomes and a handful of other 3D printing, for example. There's a lot of really exciting frontiers in medicine. At the same time, the other error is to go, oh, this is so exciting. It's going to cure everything in the world. It's going to be a panacea, and so forth, So we have all these science fictional expectations of every new technology as well. But I agree, microbiomes seem to have a finger in pretty much every medical pie, don't they?
Right. Now, I remember there's a researcher by the name of Rob Knight who said that when he first was proposing that the microbiome might be involved in diseases, the response that he got was, "Oh, you'd be crazy to think that the microbiome has anything to do with these diseases." And that has changed, he said, to the opposite, where people think it's crazy to think that the microbiome doesn't have something to do with virtually, with disease X. We've mentioned things like obesity and metabolic syndrome. So the tide is turning. And there is a much more of a expectation that there's going to be something to find here. But you're right. We have to keep our expectations reasonable. And we shouldn't think that you can just take a pill with a microbe and solve all your problems. Although that's what people would like.
I think
it's oftentimes not that easy. And just like saying the microbiome is plugged into your physiology in many ways, what you do and the lifestyle that you engage in has a big impact on your microbiome. So it has this kind of circular logic to it. But whether or not you get a good night's sleep, whether or not you're stressed, your dietary choices, whether you get exercise or not, whether you smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol or do recreational drugs, all these things are going to impact your microbiome.
I think this is a good time to give a shout out to that Australian researcher who was preaching about pylori causing ulcers for like 20 years before he got any love from the medical community. The idea just sounded too ultra to all of us to take serious. And that can sort of open up a window for you to talk a little bit about fecal transplants, which honestly sound like they're not real, but they are.
All right. So what was that guy's name?
I'm looking for it right now. I'll give it to you in just a second, actually. Barry Marshall.
Barry Marshall. I believe he got a Nobel Prize. 2005, Nobel in Physiology or Medicine awarded to Barry Marshall and also to Robin Warren for their discovery. This is on nobelprize.org, that Helicobacteria, which is a bacterium that lives in your guts, can cause peptic ulcer disease. And I think remarkably, like many in a long history of researchers who were having difficulty kind of getting people's attention, he gave himself, he drank a cocktail of Helicobacter pylori and gave himself a peptic ulcer, showing that a disease that we thought was just due to stress was in fact caused by a microbe that is a common inhabitant in your guts. And others have now followed up on this. Marty Blazer, MD, who's a infectious disease doctor, has written a lot about the microbiome. He has gone on to say, well, hey, we can't just blame microbes for all diseases. We, again, co-evolved with H. pylori, and in some cases, those microbes might be doing us some good. I think in the case of H. pylori, I'm not convinced that it's doing a whole heck of a lot of good for us. I think in most cases, it is a problem that can cause ulcers, but it certainly highlights this idea that microbes that we weren't paying attention to are doing something important and having a big impact on health outcomes that we care about. Like if you're bleeding in your gut from an ulcer, or if you have a perforation that's going to kill you, knowing the cause and understanding that a member of your stomach microbiota can actually be responsible for this is super important.
Yeah, Dr. Marshall and his early colleagues are the reason that ulcers are now curable, and they killed a lot of people. It's likely that Dr. Marshall and his early colleagues have saved more people than most of us will ever meet in our lifetime. That's just a wonderful thing to be able to say. A good example of a bacteria which can be both good and bad would be E. coli. On a bad day, it can be it's the reason children sometimes die after eating hamburger. But on a good day, it's absolutely what you need to digest ordinary foods.
So coffee, I'm glad you brought that up. And I think that, we started off this conversation by pointing out that not all germs are bad, which is true, and explaining something about the hygiene hypothesis, which is this idea that too many antibiotics and living in a sterile environment can also have untoward or unintended consequences on your body. But the flip side is there too. And as an emergency physician, I see the worst, right? I see people at their most desperate, and I see medical situations that are quite extreme. And I think even in my own specialty, that's when you sort of see the dark side of microbiomes. E. coli that are otherwise just hanging out, doing nothing, they can activate genes. They have a little genetic program that allows them to kind of turn on you, and they can become virulent or bad pathogens that are responsible for bladder infections, kidney infections, bloodstream infections, sepsis, all sorts of things. So I think understanding this other side too, not just how they are protective, but in ways that the microbiome, the good microbiome, can go bad, is something that we need to spend some time exploring.
And just to add to the frustrating complexity of it all is the fact that the same microbiome might affect you differently than me for reasons which I think are still being worked out. You probably know more about it than I do. But where I'm going with that is, are we at a stage now where we can give any actionable advice at all to our listeners?
So I'll just underline what you just said. And we've already made the point that we humans are not mice, and that some of these mice experiments, they don't translate 100% to human medicine. This is true. And in the research that I've done, one of the findings that we have found in our research is that the effect of having a disease does show itself in the microbiome, but we see huge differences in between different individual people. So yeah, we're all individuals and we can respond in different ways. And you're right. You did mention fecal transplants earlier.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so the fact that we all have these different microbiomes, that, one, we're going to respond differently to introduction of new microbes, and also might mean that if we were to try to replace our microbiome with that of maybe a healthier person, and we do this in medicine, right? We do this when people get a really bad diarrhea called C. difficile. So we give those people in my hospital fecal transplantation. But you don't always know what you're going to get.
What is a fecal transplant? That doesn't sound bad. That sounds like something nice. What's a fecal transplant?
All right. That's when a donor, right, donates some poop that gets introduced into your body. That can be by a tube, either from the top through your mouth and into your esophagus, into your stomach, or it can be sometimes from the bottom. Uh, in one study that I was, where I know the researcher very well, she looked at fecal transplantation for autism, and they took poop usually from a parent. They would sometimes screen it for certain kinds of bad pathologies, but oftentimes would just dilute it, mix it up, mix it in some chocolate milk, and have the child consume it. And that's a fecal transplant. And believe it or not, this is something which is done both in research and sometimes in clinical medicine.
Yeah, it's kind of entering the mainstream now, isn't it? It's becoming a applied technology and not just experimental.
That's right.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. And kind of the reason I wanted to go there is it sounds so ultra, like, can that really be true? And the answer is yes, that is really true. And yes, if you're one of the people who benefits, it can be very beneficial. But
It's
it just,
remarkably, this fecal transplantation for that C. diff, it works better than many of our other therapies. And I raised the point that I can't think of any other area in medicine where we don't use the most effective treatment first. It's considered second line therapy, and we do it when things have failed. But we don't do that in any other area of medicine. And I think the idea is that we're scared of it, right? And the idea is it seems kind of gross. But this is something that, again, we need to try to figure out. But I think for people who are healthy, just be aware that your lifestyle does have an impact on your microbiome. We could talk more about diet, but I'll say, hey, the reason why the Mediterranean diet, which is one that focuses on a high fiber diet that contains things like olive oil and doesn't have a lot of refined sugars in it, that's a diet which is healthy for you in large part because it cultivates a healthy microbiome. So that's an actionable thing that I would recommend that all of our listeners do.
Can you tell us anything about probiotics? And here I'm thinking things like acidophilus and live culture yogurt, and maybe the pros and cons of using them after a round of antibiotics. I know that has made it into popular culture now.
It has, and even sometimes in my practice and that of my colleagues, we will prescribe a probiotic. I guess we should define what it is. It's a microbe that we think has beneficial health benefits to us. So this is big business now, and there are trade organizations dedicated to the use of probiotics, and it's giving a microbe with the idea that it's going to keep you healthy or prevent you from getting sick or make you healthier. And we do give this to people with diarrhea sometimes, and there are a variety of different things you can buy in a drugstore that have various levels of benefit to them. The thing I'm going to tell you, Coffee and listeners, is that I recommend getting probiotics from food. And in fact, we actually make our own yogurt at home, and I make something called kombucha. So these are fermented foods, and I'd say the weight of the evidence suggests that consumption of both of those is good for you. So I think it does good things for me. We could probably spend a whole nother episode just talking about kombucha, but that's what I recommend.
I'm game for that if you want to sometime.
Yeah.
So what have I not sort of asked you about the microbiome topic that you think would be useful for the public to be more aware of?
Well, I just think, if this is the first time someone's heard about this, try to do a little more exploration into it. There are some popular books on the topic, as well as in the scientific literature that you can read up on. I'd say kind of raise up your antenna anytime you hear about the microbiome, because it is so interesting. It's such a fast moving field. It's almost impossible to keep up with all the stuff that's going on. Yes, it's not a panacea. No, there is not one size fits all or one design fits all. You should, in fact, even take the advice I gave you. Like I said, kombucha and yogurt works for me. It may not work for you, but it's something worth paying attention to, and we probably should pay more attention to it.
An interesting corollary of that is the glycemic index, I think, is also now drifted out into culture. And it makes a lot of sense to me, but it's a little frustrating that when you test individuals as opposed to populations, the glycemic index of a given food can vary quite a bit from one person to another. So while I think it's a good rough guide, the various tables that are published can be wildly out of correlation for different individuals.
That's a great point, Coffee. Yeah.
Um,
Like I said, we could spend a whole nother episode just talking about glycemic index and diet. In fact, I'd be happy to do that.
let's do that. Let's plan for that a few episodes from now.
Okay.
At least I definitely, as you know, I'm hoping to visit with you from time to time and not just a one-off. But I would like to hear a little bit more about your websites or others that you might recommend as we wrap up kind of here.
Okay. So I do have a blog, and that is evolutionmedicine.com. But actually, maybe before we get to that one, let's talk about this one that we just brought up on the live stream. Even more than my own individual website, the thing I've been up to during the last year, especially during the pandemic, is this thing called Zombified Media. And you can go to zombified.org, where you can find a whole bunch of podcasts and other resources where we talk about the microbiome, we talk about brain hijacking, we talk about how our bodies are a composite of different organisms, and we talk about parasites that affect our brains and behavior, among lots and lots of other things. This is just, it's using zombies as a way to explain science and medicine and psychology and politics and lots of other things. We go a bunch of different directions. We have a site on YouTube called Channel Z, and in Channel Z you can find my own stream, which is called the Dr. Z Show, but there's lots of other great stuff there too. So you can go to channelz.org. So these are some of the projects that I've been involved with. So for those of you that can see the background behind me here, we have the Zombie Apocalypse Medical Meeting. We've done a lot to try to to explain health and disease, as well as psychology and lots of other stuff with this frame of zombies. And then this is my own website, evolutionmedicine.com. I'd say there's a lot of stuff here on COVID. That was been a big area of interest of mine, of course, for the entire world. And I took a little break from this podcast, in fact, also from Zombified, for the last couple of months, where I just I took some time off from work. But now I'm getting back into it. So again, back into the clinical part of my job, and then back into podcasting also. So thank you for showing that. And I'm also on Twitter at Joe Alcock MD. That's another good place to reach out to me.
The range of things that you're expert at is just dazzling to me. And, we've talked a lot about sepsis, where I tend to debate you a little bit, but I always get my ass kicked when we do that.
Oh, not at all.
I will say, though, whenever my experience is, and I'm interested in your thoughts here, my experience is whenever one of my paradigms about the world gets overturned, things are different than I thought they were. We have more non-human cells than human cells in our biology. Microbiomes are our friends, things like that. I never feel threatened when my paradigms get changed. I feel that the world enlarges every time that happens.
Well, that's why you're a scientist, Coffee. No, it's good. I think that's a good way to approach the world. That one, we can't hold our ideas too tightly, especially ideas that we came up with, that even our preconceived notions about how things work, many of them are wrong. And as you know, we tell students in medicine, both in emergency medicine services and in medical school, that half what they learn is going to be incorrect in 10, 20 years. So we always have to keep an open mind about these things. And what I like about talking to you, Coffee, is that you, again, have a breadth of knowledge, which is second to none. And you have an open mind to some of these crazy ideas.
Crazy. Well, thank you so much, Joe. And hope we don't have to work quite as hard next time.
Yep. Thanks, Coffee. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
What's New in Health and Medicine with Dr. Coffee Brown, video and podcast, is produced by Shelley Carney and Toby Eunice from the AGK Media Studio in the Land of Enchantment. Please take a moment now to subscribe and leave a great review. Then share this podcast with your family and friends so they can improve their health too. Thanks for listening.